There are just 4 steps to writing a strong thesis statement. Step 1 is to know your goal. Step 2 is to check your supplies. Step 3 is to gather ingredients. And step 4 is to put it all together. So those are the 4 steps, but what do they look like in practice? Step 1 is know your goal. And in general, when you're writing a paper, your goal is going to be set by the assignment that you have. I'm putting this blue box here at the top of the screen. As we go through examples, I'm going to put our assignment up in the box. It's the main thing that should direct the way you do your work throughout the process. And when you're looking at an assignment, you want to look at least 3 things. First of all, you want to know how much you're going to be writing. Second, you need to know what kind of thing you're making. Third, and I think most important, you need to know what question is your paper supposed to answer. An essay that has a thesis statement is answering a question, but it's not any question. It's a question that could have multiple different answers, and you're going to show why your answer is right. That's what we're looking for to write our thesis and to write our whole paper. Step 2, we're going to check our supplies. For a paper, our supplies are information, and in particular, we're looking for information from our sources. Now, depending on your assignment, your sources might be lecture notes or things you've read in class. They might be research that you're supposed to do outside of class or something in between. So in a minute, we'll look at some examples of how to list out the information so you see what you have to work with. Step 3 is to gather ingredients. You have to take certain pieces of information and figure out how they could go together in ways that will fit your goal. When you're writing a thesis, you're going to have 3 types of ingredients. You're going to have your answer to the question. Second, you're going to have evidence. Evidence is information that you're going to use to show why your answer is right. And then third, opposing ideas. Remember, a thesis statement answers a question that has more than one possible answer. So coming up with opposing ideas is almost like a double check that you're on the right track. It also helps strengthen your argument because it shows the reader that you've considered multiple perspectives. Finally, step 4 is to put it all together. And I'm simply going to take my answer and my evidence and my opposing ideas and put them into a sentence. As you're bringing these things over, you might be making a few changes. For example, you might put your evidence or your opposing ideas before or after your answer. They can go in any order. And you might be making other changes. You might add linking or contrasting words or phrases to connect your evidence or your opposing ideas to your answer. You might add details to clarify things for the reader. You might change the way you say something in order to fit better with the type of assignment that you have. Or you might change what you're including in the thesis statement itself. A thesis statement always has to include your answer, but sometimes you might introduce your evidence or introduce your opposing ideas somewhere else in the first portion of your paper. But keeping all 3 in there is a really good practice, and that's what we're going to do today. So that's a quick overview of how we can use these 4 steps to construct a thesis statement, but now let's see what that looks like in practice. Let's say we have an assignment that says, respond to the following in a 5 to 7 page essay. Economic stress was the most significant cause of, and then it gives some historical event. So let's figure out our goal. How much? We have a 5 to 7 page essay. And what kind? We're responding in an essay, so we know we're writing an argument, but there's no other specification. So that means we have a bit of flexibility in how we put our argument together. Now, what about the question? There isn't a question written down for us, but with this kind of prompt, we can actually turn it into a question fairly easily. Perhaps the quickest way to turn this into a question is just to rephrase it. And instead of saying economic stress was the most significant, you can just ask, was economic stress the most significant? And that would work because there could be multiple perspectives on that. You might agree or disagree or say in some way of thinking yes, in another way of thinking no. But I think it's actually easier to make the question more open-ended to start with. So let's try the question, what was or were the most significant causes of this historical event and why? We might end up going back and saying we agree with the initial idea of it was economic stress, but it also might be other ideas. So that's a good question, and let's move on to step 2. We're going to get some supplies as we gather information. So let's go through the sources that we have. Let's say we have some primary source evidence from manuscripts, and that as we read through that, we see that those documents are talking about economics and they're also talking about religion. Then we also have some secondary sources that are written by historians or other scholars later on looking back at an event. And most of those arguments focus on economics. But maybe we also notice that some secondary sources mention other factors, religion, politics, and/or technology. Now I'm putting a little ellipsis here because if I was going through this in a real life scenario, I would make a lot more specific notes, but this is enough for our example. Now let's move to step 3, gather ingredients. I'm going to use the information from my sources to gather at least 3 types of ingredients for my paper. First, I need my answer to the question. Let's say that I think about the information I have and I decide that economics and religion were equally important causes of this event. But then I need to make sure that I have evidence to back that up. The main reason I chose my answer is based on the primary sources because those manuscripts focus on both religion and economics. And so I'm going to say that if the primary sources focus on those two, that those two are together most important. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't mean I won't use any secondary sources in my paper. I'll plan to use many different types of sources. It's just that the primary sources will be the main basis for most of my argument. Now, I could summarize each of the main points I'm going to make in the paper. And if your instructor requires that approach, then definitely do it that way. But here, I've decided to take a different approach. And when I do that, I just know that later on in my paper, either later in the introduction or at the top of each section, I'll need to summarize each of my main points. And then third, I'm going to make sure that there are opposing ideas. And here we know there are opposing ideas because the scholars who wrote secondary sources have been emphasizing economics. So we know that not everyone is emphasizing religion to that same degree. Now, there's not only one right answer to any of these questions. For example, another possible opposing idea that I could say is that multiple factors were at play, but I'm going to stick with what I had. All right, let's move to step 4 and put it all together into a thesis statement. I'll just make a bit of space here, and then I'll start by putting my answer to the question. And when I write this out, I'm going to add just a couple more detail words to make it a little clearer, but it's the same idea. I say both economic stress and religious strife were equally influential. And when I came up with my ingredients, I got my answer first, and then my evidence, and then my opposing ideas. But here, I'm going to put my evidence before my answer. So I'm going to say manuscript evidence reveals that both economic stress and religious strife were equally influential. And here, the linking word that I'm using is reveals to show the connection between the manuscript evidence and my answer. And finally, I'm going to help the reader understand some opposing ideas. And I'm going to actually put that first in my sentence. So even before the evidence, I'm going to start the sentence by saying, although some scholars emphasize economic stress as the most important factor. And here I have the contrasting word although, and that's going to put this part of the sentence in opposition to what comes after it. So altogether I have, although some scholars emphasize economic stress as the most important factor, manuscript evidence reveals that both economic stress and religious strife were equally influential. This is a fantastic statement that clearly responds to the prompt in the essay and that sets me up to do so even more for 5 to 7 pages. So this is great. Let's move on to one more example. This assignment says, in a 5 to 7 page essay, compare and contrast the views of scholar X, scholar Y, and scholar Z on a certain topic. So how much do we need to be writing? 5 to 7 pages. So we know we're going to need a good amount of evidence. And what kind of paper are we writing? Well, we're writing an essay, an argumentative paper, but more than that, we're focusing on comparing and contrasting. And then what question is my paper going to be answering? Because the assignment is about the views of different scholars, maybe a good way to turn that into a question would be to say something like, which perspective is most persuasive and why? All right, let's move on to step 2 and look for supplies, the information we have from our sources. And here, the sources are going to be the things that scholar X, Y, and Z wrote. So let's say I've read carefully through all of their writings. Maybe one thing I'm looking for is to see whether I think anything any of them says is unreasonable. And we'll imagine that no, I decide actually everything that all of the scholars say is reasonable. And maybe I move on to compare the works in different ways. So maybe I notice that X has the most detailed analysis, but Y and Z use the most sources. And maybe I also notice that although none of the arguments take all factors into account, Z is the scholar that takes the most factors into account. And again, in a real scenario, I'd be making a much more detailed list here. This is just a shortened list for our example. Now moving on to step 3, gather ingredients. Let's Let's imagine I've taken a long time to read over the articles and consider their pros and cons, and I've decided that Z's view is the most persuasive. Now, there's a few things that Z has going for it. It has reasonable arguments, and it's one of the two that use the most sources. But let's imagine the thing that stood out most to me about Z is that Z takes the most factors into account. And I even think I can write multiple different paragraphs about why some of the extra factors that Z took into account are very important. And so I'm planning to structure my paper around those main points. So here in my ingredients for my evidence, I'm just going to summarize by saying Z takes the most factors into account. Now in my paper, I'll probably mention a lot of the other things I have under information, that all arguments are reasonable, that Y and Z use the most sources, and more. But for my thesis statement, which is a summary of the most important features of my paper, I'm just going to focus on the fact that Z takes most factors into account. And then third, are there any opposing ideas? Well, yes, because I know that all three scholars have added to our knowledge of this topic. All three had reasonable arguments. Maybe somebody else might argue they all have pluses and minuses, but none of them are really that outstanding. So somebody else might have a different view, but I have this view about Z. All right, so we're ready to move on to step 4. Let me just move these up out of the way a little bit. When I start putting my ingredients into my thesis statement, I'm going to put my opposing ideas first, and then my answer, and then my evidence. Now, it would be possible in this case to take my ingredients more or less directly and just add a couple of words to phrase them into a sentence. So I could say something like, although all scholars have added to our knowledge, Z's view is the most persuasive because it takes the most factors into account. That would work well, but because the assignment indicates we're supposed to do comparison and contrast, I'm going to change my wording a little bit to reflect more of a contrast. So I'm going to say, despite scholars X and Y having added to our understanding of this topic, their views are not as persuasive as scholar Z's because they did not take as many factors into account. First, I just want to point out that I am using the linking word because to make sure that I connect my evidence to my answer, and I'm using the word despite to show that the first part of the sentence contrasts with my answer. All right, so why did I write the sentence this way? I am trying to set up a very clear contrast between scholars X and Y on the one hand and scholar Z on the other. And so in each part of the sentence, I'm trying to show what is different about these things. So when I stated my answer, instead of saying Z's view is the most persuasive, which highlights Z, I'm setting up this contrast that says X and Y are not as persuasive as Z. And in a similar way, for my opposing idea, instead of focusing on the fact that all scholars added to knowledge, I'm focusing on X and Y specifically as a way to sort of imply, sure, they did this, but... And so I'm saying despite X and Y having added to our understanding. And finally, with my evidence, instead of saying that Z takes the most factors into account, I'm putting that in contrast with X and Y by saying X and Y did not take as many factors. So I've added some phrases that are comparative, like not as many or not as persuasive, in order to show the difference between X and Y and Z. It's the same general idea as what I had in all my ingredients, but the way I phrased it is more along the lines of a comparison and contrast. So I'm really happy with this. It has all the information I need, and I think it'll work really well to support the rest of my essay. Let me know if you have any questions or other things that work well for you. Thanks so much for watching, and follow for more writing tips.